Our final presenter is Yasuko Kase. Kase is an associate professor of American literature at the University of Ryukyus in Okinawa, Japan. From October 2018 through July 2019, she was a Fulbright Research Fellow at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, hosted by the Race, Indigeneity, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Initiative. During this time, she worked on her project, Race, Trauma, Medicine, Asian American Writing on the Asian Pacific War. In this project, Kase problematizes the homogeneous nation-bound memory of the Asian Pacific War that repeatedly produces sheer binaries of victim-perpetrator and hero-perpetrator by creating a dialogue between Asian American writing on the war and an alternative form of trauma theory, which bridges several conflicting fields such as neuroscience, disability studies, and literary trauma studies. Today, Kase will be presenting her talk entitled Trauma, Affect, and Kinship in Chang-Rae Lee's A Gesture Life.
My paper aims to demonstrate how Korean American writer Chang-Rae's novel A Gesture Life complicates the literary field of trauma study by the use of excessive elements that the traditional trauma theory has not fully focused on. Lee's novel A Gesture Life deals with the problematic issues of comfort women or sex slave of the Japanese military during the Asian Pacific War. The theater of World War II fought in the Pacific and Asia. While many Korean American artists and writers, including Nora Okjo-Keller, have engaged with the historical trauma using a victim's perspective, Lee installed Franklin Hatter, or Doc Hatter, who is both a victimizer and a victim. And thus offers a particular war memory which has been submerged. Doc Hatter is a colonized ethnic Korean who serves the Japanese Imperial Army as a paramedic. While he is stationed in Singapore, Hatter rapes a Korean comfort woman, Kay, or Kukta, who he loves deeply but whose affection is not reciprocated. He eventually discovers her body, which has been brutally gang raped and dismembered by a group of Japanese soldiers. The traditional model of trauma theory focusing on issues of the amnesia and the fracture of the victim's memory, but A Gesture Life disrupts the field by dealing with traumatic memory of the ambiguous subject as both victimizer and victim, and thus cannot fully conform to the traditional model. While Doc Hatter's fragmented narrative can be interpreted as a typical trauma narrative, the reader also experiences various modes of silence in his narrative, which cannot be fully reduced to a neurological symptom of trauma. In my analysis of Lee's novel, focusing on the excessive elements that fall into blind spot of traditional trauma theory, I discuss how Lee offers an alternative memory of the Asian Pacific War in his novel. Recent criticisms toward the dominant model of trauma theory and the scholarly effort to revitalize this field question the universalized view of traumatic reaction. The most influential model created by Kase Caruso and her followers in the early 1990s elegantly combined psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk's idea of traumatic symptom with Derridean deconstruction. Kase and van der Kolk claim that trauma is an extreme event that cannot fully assimilate into the regular memory system, and thus trauma victims cannot directly access those memories. However, after a latent period of amnesia, memory of the traumatic event returns in the form of flashbacks and nightmares that are literal or veridical and undistorted with symbolic representations. In other words, according to them, the traumatic memory is a pure, undistorted memory that cannot be fully represented by language. While this dominant Carrusian model remains strongly influential, scholars in the field of trauma theory are attempting to engage alternative perspectives, methods, and scholarly objects to explore trauma issues in history, literature, visual arts, and other forms of cultural products. Ruth Rees introduces one of the earliest criticisms by questioning the unrepresentability of traumatic memory. While van der Kolk denies the linguistic representativity of traumatic memory, he suggests that the memory can be retrievable through non-linguistic or iconic kinds of visual images. Rees counters that iconic is essentially symbolic, and as such is neither veridical nor a direct way of accessing the particular traumatic memory. Although he overall claims the unrepresentativity of trauma, van der Kolk and his colleague Ono van der Hart also praised that French psychologist and psychotherapist Pierre Janet, who they believe successfully integrated his patient's traumatic memory into a regular memory system. In their writing, the intrusive past, the flexibility of memory, and the engraving of trauma, which is included in the seminal edited volume of Trauma, Exploration in Memory, edited by Carruth, by referring to a research on the brain as the evidence of supporting Janet's claim of the uniqueness of traumatic memory, van der Kolk and van der Hart note, although at the time of traumatic crisis, usually traumatic memory is stated as implicit memory and cannot be retrieved through narrative. Janet successfully retrieved and integrated his patient Irene's traumatic implicit memory into a narrative memory. Irene had a hard time to accept her mother's death from tuberculosis after a long period of nursing her and being exhausted from supporting her family financially. She persistently denied her mother's death while reenacting the death scene. Although they used the notion of implicit memory, I am not sure their understanding and use of implicit memory are accurate. Maybe I should ask Janet about this, but this is my reading. Okay? Even though they claim that in usual circumstances, implicit memory can be assimilated to regular memory system smoothly, actually, in usual circumstances, implicit memory can operate independently from explicit memory and does not require consciousness for either storage or retrieval. In the emotional brain, the neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux writes that it is possible that the traumatized has poor conscious memory of a traumatic experience while forming a very strong implicit memories through amygdala-mediated fear conditioning. However, Ledoux notes, quote, there is no way for these powerful implicit memories to then be converted to explicit memories. Again, if a conscious memory wasn't formed, it cannot be recovered, unquote. Ruth Rees also questions van der Kolk's claim based upon Janet's study. According to Rees, in addition to assimilating or integrating her traumatic memory to narrative memory, Janet needed to liquidate a part of Irene's memory for her recovery. Thus, although van der Kolk praises Janet's method, Rees points out that Janet also eliminated and altered the memory of his patient. Scholars such as Michel Balaev and Step Crafts challenge the rigid universal model of the traditional trauma theory by pointing out the tendency of the dominant model to ignore the significant influence of the particular socio-historical context of a traumatic event, and thus to reductively apply the theory in a way that produces a certain formulistic literary analysis. Citing from various opinions on traumatic symptoms and memory, Baraev points out the fact that traumatized people do not take a uniform reaction to a traumatic event, as Van der Kolk claims, and that traumatized do not necessarily reveal the symptom of dissociation. On the other hand, Krabs examined the definition of trauma and recovery and notes that those are created as a medical historical product of Western modernity, and that the resulting universalization of the notion of trauma and the application to the non-Western world are therefore problematic. Alan Gibbs offers very insightful analysis about the perpetrator trauma, one of which stimulates a discussion of the problematic conflation of post-traumatic stress disorder and the trauma theory. PTSD became a part of psychiatric profession's diagnostic canon in 1980. Through the political claims of Vietnam War veterans. And thus the notion was created through the research on veterans' trauma, which of course included perpetrator trauma. Trauma theory in the humanities, by contrast, originated in Holocaust studies and takes a victim's perspective. Gibbs elucidates the difficulty for trauma theory in dealing with the trauma of victimizers. Trauma theory differs to the sufferer, and thus perpetrators are transformed into victims. The self-reflective criticisms within the field of trauma theory I have briefly introduced aimed to problematize the universal application of the rigid traditional trauma model on every trauma cases. The socialization and the politicization of both trauma and the trauma theory are especially necessary for considering the effect of long-term exposure of trauma of sexual and racial violence. As Gibbs pointed out, the insidious trauma or the long-term exposure to traumatic stress cannot be fully discussed in a punctual model, or a traumatic symptom originate from one powerful traumatic event that traditional trauma theory depends upon. The question toward the traditional model regarding literacy of traumatic memory is a huge challenge for scholars in the field of literature, including myself, because I really love Kase's work. She writes so beautifully. And yet, there are so many cases that trauma victims do not reveal the symptom of traumatic amnesia as the traditional model claims, and thus the analysis of traumatic memory needs to be more fully and meticulously explored in the field of literature. In considering the above self-reflective criticism within the field of trauma theory, I will demonstrate my analysis of gesture life by focusing on trauma issues in this novel. A gesture life is situated outside of the dominant geographical realm of traditional trauma model. Appreciating the criticism leveled at the Eurocentric model of trauma theory for its adequate consideration for the socio-historical and cultural context of racial and or ethnic minorities literary text, I pay attention to the colonial and post-colonial dynamics of the Asian Pacific War and its aftermath, the context in which the encounter between the colonizer and the colonizer took place. I avoid a method that may suggest a pure, non-Western model of trauma and recovery for the situation of the historical process of colonization and decolonization creates complex spaces of mixing rather than the one for maintained racial and cultural purity. I will examine two main issues here. One, how the dominant ideologies and the particular symbolic role of dog hunters host societies, Japan and the US, regulate his narrative performance and a gesture life as a docile subject of two nations. And two, how his own volatile affect, triggered by reminders of the hidden kinship of his Koreanness, disrupt and disorder his own narrative. Here, rather than following the traditional model that treats traumatic memory as a special memory that cannot be integrated into narrative memory, I highlight the interaction between the influence of politically and culturally coded symbolic order or the dominant ideological belief of that region and era on Hata's trauma narrative and the trauma's affective elements revealed in his own narrative and physical symptoms. I use Jack Derrida's notion of the law of hospitality to analyze Doc Hata's narrative performance as a perfect guest in both host societies of Japan and the US. Then I examine how his hidden kinship traces his past as both a victim and victimizer of traumatic atrocities during the war, challenging his own narrative performance. In Of Hospitality, Jack Derrida discusses the law of hospitality, or the symbolic order of the host to which the guest must conform from the moment they enter the host territory to receive hospitality. In other words, hospitality is not unconditional, but a conditional gift. As I have discussed elsewhere, the law of hospitality then can be useful for analyzing the situation of immigration, refugees, and the people who experience diasporic dislocation through which they all enter the domain of their host country as guests. The law of each particular host dictates the cultural and racial codes that the guest must follow. Thus, racial and or ethnic minorities are exposed to power imbalances in the host society. To obey the law of hospitality, Doc Hata is compelled to perform as a good guest of his host, Japan in his early life and later on the US. In Feeling of Kinship, Queer Liberalism and the Racialization of Intimacy, David L. Ng discusses the necessity of linking transnational adoption with the global history of colonization, capitalist exploitation, immigration issues, and the power relationship revealed in race and gender issues. While adoption can be largely claimed as an act of humanitarianism, love, altruism, salvation, and or redemption, transracial and transnational adoption involve issues of assimilation to the dominant culture and the presence of ideological messages that may lag behind a humanitarian act. Doc Hata's adoption by a powerful Japanese family, the Kurohatas, reveals the involvement of a colonial power relationship between Korea and Japan then. Thus, although family is generally supposed to be a unit for expressing intimacy, rather than exhibiting personal closeness, Doc Hata performs polite gestures to gain acceptance by his adoptive family. Later serving the Japanese Imperial Army, he further tries to prove his loyalty to the host country. After he immigrated to the US, he presented himself as a Japanese immigrant, and therefore he never reveals his ethnic background as a Korean. Even when he adopted a girl, Sunny, from Korea, who is a mixed-race child between a Korean woman and supposedly a Black American GI, he always introduces other people, Sunny's ethnic background, as Japanese. He ran a medical and surgical supply shop, Sunny Medical Supply, in a small picturesque town called Betlehem in the East Coast, until his recent retirement. Although he is not a physician, the people in Bethlehem call him with the title. In his life in the US, he never reveals his frustration or resentment towards the racial injustice of the host country. Even when he experiences racial discrimination and harassment, he, quote, never reported the incident or confronted the perpetrators, unquote. In Bethlehem, he politely performs as a typical Asian American model minority who never makes waves and who is living proof of the American conservatives' claim that the minority can be successful. In the midst of the Asian American modern minority created after World War II, Asian Americans, unlike other minority groups, were expected to achieve the American dream without any governmental assistance, such as affirmative action and welfare. Around the time that Dr. Hatta immigrated to the US was competing with communist rivals in the international sphere and trying to contain liberal and radical groups in a domestic sphere, such as civil rights and the feminist movement. Without disturbing this Cold War ideological propaganda of his new host country, Dr. Hatta follows the law of hospitality and thus represent a perfect guest who never betrays or brings shame to his host. Indeed, to receive his host hospitality, Dr. Hatta reads its social code perfectly, follows it strictly, and never breaks it. With careful management of proper distance from his white neighbors, he presently declared, quote, "I wasn't unwelcomed," unquote, in a privileged neighborhood. David L. Ng and Shin-Hee Han point out that the modern minority myth is a form of racial melancholia, which mimics the idealized power of white and sustained interminable grief and attachment to the unattainable dominant norms of white middle class. Indeed, racial melancholia is precisely the state in which Dr. Hatta remains. His proximity to the idealized hegemonic subject of the modern nation state is manifest in the way he is called, Dr. Hatta. In Bethlehem, he created his life as if he is a real doctor. He purchases a large Victorian family house with a garden in a wealthy suburb where real physicians' families are living. From the time of his purchase, he struggles to renovate his real estate. Obviously, he cannot afford to hire someone to repair the house and take care of his garden like a real doctor can, so he plans and works by himself. This family house symbolically reveals his desire, and he attempts to create a socially accepted life as a man with a family. The culmination of his project is the adoption of a Korean girl, Sunny. Throughout his narrative, he silences unpleasant information or criticism that he doesn't want to believe. However, he narrates the way other people talk about it, and thus leaves the authenticity of the information ambiguous. In other words, his narrative simultaneously depicts both what he believes and what other people believe or say. Yet, in his own mind, he never critically integrates other people's perspectives into his own. Hatta expresses what he believes when he says, quote, "I'm respected and valued in this town. I'm asked to comment at all the critical council meetings. Sunny, you have little idea what my position is. People heed my words," unquote. Sunny, however, tells him a different story. Quote, "You know what I overheard down at the card shop? How nice it is to have such a good Charlie to organize the garbage and the sidewalk cleaning schedule. That's what they really think of you. It's become your job to be the #1 citizen," unquote. For Dr. Hatta, dependent upon the law of hospitality to be accepted in the US, his entire relationship depends upon such polite exchange like market economy. Sunny observes how Dr. Hatta attempts to receive benefit from the people around him. Quote, "You give these gifts out, just like to the policewoman Kono. She cannot stand to cross you because you are this nice, sweet man who's given when he didn't have to. You burden with your generosity," unquote. Not only consenting to the law of hospitality, he is willing to excessively enforce the law in order to make the people treat him nicely. His plan to fully assimilate into bedridden eventually crumbles completely. Sunny disappears from Hata's life, and Hata's romantic relationship with a white widow, Mary, whom he had dreams to marry, eventually ends. Furthermore, his Victorian family house, which he has laboriously renovated and meticulously maintained, is damaged by a small fire that he causes. The ideal successful upper middle class family image maintained by his gesture life is marred and damaged. After causing a small fire, Hata develops an incessant cough and chest pains. While these symptoms originate from inhaling smoke from the fire, they suppress the regularity of his smooth narrative and can be interpreted as a manifestation of hidden and silenced trauma and kinship which he has suppressed throughout his life. The lack of real intimacy or the raw affective closeness and real kinship, along with his erasure of his Koreanness that he has suppressed, return to challenge his performance. Okay, now I will read a little bit long citation from Gesture Life, and this is a primary scene of Hata's trauma. Then they were all gone. I walked the rest of the way to the clearing. The air was cooler there, the treetops shading the falling sun. Mostly it was like any place I have ever seen. Yet I could not smell or hear or see as I did my medic work. I could not feel my hands as they gathered, nor could I feel the weight of such remains. And I could not sense that other tiny elfin form I eventually discovered, miraculously whole. I could not see the figured legs and feet, the utter, blessed digitation of their hands. After murdering Captain Ono, an army physician, and Hata's barrier, Kukta or Kei is kidnapped, gang raped by more than 30 Japanese soldiers, and murdered. When Hata discovers Kukta's body, his eyes both see and do not see her body that is brutally dismembered, and her baby whose body, by contrast, remains miraculously intact. He is obviously covered and soaked in her blood while gathering her remains. While the graphic image evoked in this scene is horrific, this scene also presents an uncanny association between intimacy and medicine. Medically close as a paramedic gathering Kukuta's body fragment remains, and intimately close to her completely drenched in Kei's blood. The conflation between intimacy and medicine encapsulates his experience of traumatic loss and the discovery of the truth. Kukuta was pregnant, which he had failed to notice or did not want to believe. It haunted his gesture life. The confrontation of intimacy and medicine is typically revealed through doctors' authority over their patient in a war zone, where they can fully manipulate and control the lives of the soldiers. Furthermore, because doctors can access the confidential medical history of a patient, and because patients confide in their doctors, including secret and shameful stories, they can develop intimacy, however professionally inappropriate. Hata admires Captain Ono's surgical skill and authority and power over the unit and desires to be like him. Just as he is suspended in a state of perpetual melancholia adjacent to the white ideal in the US, so too during the war. As a paramedic, he experiences a sustained position proximate, but not equal, to the hegemonic Japanese imperial subject and a real physician. Throughout his narrative, Dr. Hata's original name, a significant sign of his Korean kinship, is never revealed. Clearly, he was given a Korean name by his biological parents, considering the fact that his background was shaped growing up in his ethnic neighborhood in Japan. Indeed, he silences his birth name, even his Korean surname, throughout his narrative. His Japanese name, Jiro Kurohata, appeared in his narration of his conversation with Kukuta when she addresses him in an intimate manner. Given his powerful memory of Kukuta then, which still haunts his life, calling her Kei instead of Kukuta seems strange. Does Kei sound more neutral without evoking any ethnic trace? By calling the love of his life simply Kei, Hata seems to eliminate any affective memory related to her. Additionally, the omission of Kuro, which means black in Japanese, from his Japanese surname, may be more than just a social convenience in the new host country. That is, his memory of Kukuta, his Koreanness, and his Japanese name Kurohata are all interconnected. As if mocking Hata's background as a Korean adoptee, Captain Ono orders him to raise a black flag, Kurohata. Flag is Hata, and Kuro is black. And to prepare Kukuta for a service as a sex slave, a black flag was raised at the gate of Japanese villages in the past to warn of contagion. Upon immigrated to the US, Jiro Kurohata becomes a new self, Franklin Hata, as if to erase the associative memory between the flag, his Japanese name, and Kukuta's fate. The hidden kinship disrupt his perfect performance as a colonized guest. While Hata is spending his time with Kukuta and talking to her in Korean, his hidden kinship of Koreanness re-emerges. Emphasizing their shared Koreanness, Kukuta tries to create a kinship as a brother and sister. However, Hata is attracted to Kukuta, desires a more intimate relationship, and dreams of marrying her after the war. Hata fails Kukuta by raping her and by not answering her desperate request to shoot her so she can avoid a horrific death. It is ironic that in becoming a victimizer by raping her and desiring to possess her, he achieves an equal position with a Japanese hegemonic subject that he has desired for so long. Quote, this is Kukuta's word to him. You are a decent man, Lieutenant, but really you are not any different from the rest, unquote. According to the symbolic law of colonial hospitality, Hata's Koreanness should be a hidden shame. But here, it is his similarity to the colonizer that Kukuta denounces as shame. In a gesture life, Lee depicts the historical trauma of the Asian Pacific War using a unique protagonist. Doc Hata's particular position as both a victimizer and a victim allows the reader to explore a more nuanced way of discussing complex trauma issues. Lee's engagement with historical setting, moreover, demands an analysis of the concrete socio-historical background and the power dynamics of race and ethnicity. A gesture life calls for a revision for the traditional trauma paradigm. Okay, thank you.